the region sometimes has this reputation for being incredibly radical and revolutionary. There's change, there's coups, there's constant effervescence of events. Nothing sort of stays quite the same. But then there are also these extraordinary continuities and remarkable stability and consistency in patterns that we observe in politics in the region. And I think that sort of tension between continuity and change is one of the major themes of Latin America. Hugo Chávez is a fascinating example of what is sometimes referred to in Latin America as a populist leader or a Bonapartist leader. He's obviously a remarkably charismatic individual, somebody with a huge capacity to connect to people. Ordinary people would say, when I listened to politicians in the past, it seemed as if they were talking to each other. It was sort of people from another world. But when I listen to Hugo Chávez on the radio, it's as if he's talking directly to me. So he has this remarkable ability, I think, to connect with people and to kind of tap into their hopes and their aspirations and give a bit of a sense of direction and kind of restore some dignity to people who had felt excluded and marginalized from politics for basically forever. When Chávez came to power, he was elected in 1998 after an unsuccessful coup attempt for which he was imprisoned, but then pardoned. He then decided to run for office. And his biggest fear was to become part of the kind of electoral machinery of the status quo, of not making change. So here again, this theme, he wanted to bring about change. So what he thought while he was in prison was he imagined, well, suppose that we're going to do something like the French Revolution. And so what we really need to do is to create an assembly that will be truly sovereign, that can change everything. And that sovereign, that constituent power, will be the beginning of a revolution in our country. I want to get elected, but I don't just want to be any old elected official. I want to bring about a profound transformation. And so that, in fact, is what he promised. He ran on a campaign of creating a constituent assembly. He won the election. He submitted the proposal to a referendum. He won the referendum, and so he then convened this Constituent Assembly, which in fact supplanted the existing Congress and rewrote the Constitution. Now the curious thing is, if you actually look at that constitutional document, it's not really radically different from the document of 1961. So it's not clear that at the beginning, Chávez truly had an understanding of, or had an alternative political model in mind. What he wanted to do was to use this constituent process to accumulate political power so that he could bring about fundamental change. But it wasn't clear what the vision of that would be. He then, of course, faced massive resistance on the part of employers, the business community, and many of their employees, traditional trade unions and conservative political parties. And he fought back, he prevailed against that, he was reelected. And it's really after he's reelected in 2006 that Chávez begins to talk about socialism for the 21st century. And we begin to see the development of an alternative political model, which really the reason why Chávez is so confrontational is he wins power and hence has electoral legitimacy, but he wants to bring about a revolution. He doesn't really have revolutionary legitimacy. So what he's doing is constantly provoking opposition and then using the confrontations to radicalize the revolutionary process. And of course, now once Chávez is now passed away, died in 2013, and so it's unclear what the future of that process will be. But I think it is a good example of, on the one hand, someone who aspires to bring about genuinely revolutionary change, but in the process, in doing so, in some ways reproduces some of the most traditional features of Latin American politics, the personalism around the leader and the sense that the leader is the sort of the center of the whole solar system. Chávez has drawn upon the Bolivarian tradition and tried to situate his revolution, this process, which he calls the Bolivarian revolutionary process, in relation to Bolívar, who for him is an enormously significant 19th century figure. And you know, Bolivar was a very complex politician and political thinker. You know, my sense is that Chávez has a fairly kind of flat reading, one-dimensional reading of Bolivar. So let me say a few things about who Bolivar was, and then sort of fast forward to Chávez today. So Bolivar was really a critical leader of the independence struggle against the Spaniards. He was highly sophisticated, creative thinker and a brilliant tactician. But the process of independence was never a social revolution. The independence struggle really emerged out of a cleavage between the peninsulares, people who were born in Spain and who were largely responsible for managing the affairs of the colonial regions, and the Creoles, which were Europeans who were born in the New World, and who were largely excluded from the involvement in the colonial administration. Bolivar is a Creole, so he represents the European, the white Europeans in the New World who chafed under the yoke of Spanish domination. And so he struggled to overturn the Spanish Empire. But I think it's interesting that that Bolivar, when he looks at the landscape of the Americas at the time of independence, he says, we have no usable history. We've been denied the possibility of exercising even active tyranny within our own region. We've been excluded from government. We have no models to build on. We're unlike the Europeans, who, after the fall of the Roman Empire and after the period of the Dark Ages, were able to rebuild Europe in the image of this kind of past that it had. Whereas for Bolivar, his feeling was that the Spaniards had excluded the Creoles from holding office and from developing their own institutions. And I think that's really quite true. So that after independence happens, the newly independent Creole elite has to look around for new models of governance, of new models for development, and they turn to France, they turn to the United Kingdom, they turn to the United States, and they import those models. And so by saying that they don't have that the region doesn't have any usable history, in a sense, what Bolivar was doing was turning his back on the region's own indigenous communities and traditions and so forth. And so in that sense, Bolivar, I think really represents a very complex and ambiguous figure. The process of independence was not necessarily a good thing from the point of view of the indigenous people, because what it actually did was to empower the Creoles, the local Creole elites, who often were more predatory in their attitude toward the indigenous people than the Spaniards themselves had been, the Spanish colonial administration had been. And so what I think Chávez wants to do is to look back at the process of independence and see it as the start of a revolution, but an incomplete one. And Bolivar as being this sort of figure, in one sense, he's kind of a tragic figure, because he tries to bring about fundamental change, and he feels at the end of his days much frustrated by his inability to, he talks about, writing constitutions is like plowing the sea and so forth. So he was frustrated by the difficulty of implanting in this new world robust and enduring institutions. And so I think what Chávez is trying to do is to say, let's complete the kind of process of emancipation that Bolivar began. But I think what he's sort of perhaps forgetting in his interpretations of Bolivar was that Bolivar himself never saw himself as the liberator of the Native Americans. He always saw himself as the representative of the Creole class. A big part of the history of Latin America is a history of the struggle for inclusion. So when we think about the colonial period, I think one of the things that to me is most remarkable about the colonial period is that when the Spaniards first arrive in the New World, there are some among them, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, for example, who are really genuinely interested in creating a kind of a synthesis between European and these New World cultures that they've discovered. People like Bartolomé de las Casas, a great admirer of the Indians, and talks about how their institutions and their forms of governance were things that the sages of Athens could admire. So there were a lot of Spaniards who came to the New World and perhaps even romanticized a little bit the populations that they encountered as being somehow less corrupted than the Europeans, and hoped that they could find a bridge between their European culture and the cultures of the New World. But pretty quickly, more conservative forces prevail, and you get this prohibition on translation of documents from native tongues into Spanish and vice versa, of educating the Indians. And so for about a 300-year period of time, Indians are actually excluded from all of the benefits of literacy. They're treated as subhuman and is in no way full citizens. And the process of independence does not fundamentally change that. So much of the region remains excluded from the participation in government. I mean, and Bolívar himself expresses ambivalence about whether people in the New World are actually capable of governing themselves, something very different from how the framers of the U.S. Constitution talk about the citizens in the United States. And I think that then means that for the period from the 1820s to the present, large parts of the public, in a sense, are excluded from government. You have restrictions on people who are not literate, from not enabling them to vote. But more importantly, it's not just formal and institutional restrictions. It's also the degree to which the elites feel that it is part of their responsibility to create the conditions for effective citizenship and for full participation, both in the market and in government. And so there were people like Simón Rodriguez who were actually very progressive, and Rodriguez was constantly urging Bolívar not just to build institutions for the Creole class, but to expand and to educate, to bring the language that was used at the time is to bring the Indians into civilization. And there are places in Latin America where this really did happen, even in the 19th century. Uruguay, Costa Rica, for example, are early pioneers in the creation of secular education, of building schools and clinics, and of promoting citizenship. Now, it's not surprising that these are places that were marginal to the colonial enterprise, and that also tended not to have large indigenous populations or a lot of natural resources. So you don't have the pressures of extractivism that you get where, southern Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, these are places where you have huge indigenous populations. So there's a long tradition of labor, repressive agriculture, of institutions like the enganche and so forth. And where the elites regard the population as an instrument for extraction of resources. And where those patterns of very repressive agriculture and repressive labor relations exist, it's much harder to build citizenship. But in these other places that were more marginal, you did begin to see investments in citizenship, and consequently, to this day, a much higher quality of democracy and much less of a tendency to see the kinds of leaders that Chávez is, or Evo, which are leaders who are in a very strong and radical way are demanding inclusion, demanding recognition, demanding that they be incorporated into the political system.